Hello and welcome back. We've got a really compelling piece today. It's a theological argument that most modern Christian practice on food flatly contradicts apostolic rules against eating blood.
It's a fantastic foundation. The author has done the homework, connecting Genesis and Leviticus right through to Acts. Super clear. But to really make it land, we've got to get ahead of the opposition.
Right. So let's dive in. To maximize its persuasive impact, the material needs to more explicitly address the prevailing theological rationale that mainstream denominations use to, justify dismissing the blood bans in Acts 15.
Exactly that. I mean, the piece notes that pastors sort of explain away the bans,
Mm-hmm.
but the weakness here is that it doesn't really grapple with their main argument, the really sophisticated one.
Which is the New Covenant argument.
Yes, precisely. The one that says Christ's atonement fulfilled the whole sacred symbolism of blood that you see in, say, Leviticus 17.
So the idea is that the symbol is fulfilled, therefore the physical practice is now obsolete.
That's the strongest move. It uses the author's own proof text right back at them. And by not tackling that head-on, the piece feels a little incomplete, like it's talking past the main counter-argument.
It lets the opposition frame the debate. They can just say, oh, you're confusing ceremonial law with moral law, and then just move on.
Exactly. So the suggestion is to introduce a dedicated section, and I think it has to be pretty early on, that anticipates and then systematically dismantles that specific counterclaim.
Okay.
You have to show why the prohibitions on blood and things strangled weren't just some temporary cultural thing to keep Jewish and Gentile believers happy.
Right, not just a temporary bridge. So how would an author do that without getting totally sidetracked into a whole different debate on law and grace?
Well, there are a couple of ways. One approach could be to look at how scholars usually categorize the 4 prohibitions from Acts 15.
They usually split them, right? Idolatry and immorality are moral, blood and strangled things are ceremonial.
Yes, and that's the split you need to challenge. The material could argue, pretty forcefully I think, that the blood ban isn't just another dietary rule like, not eating pork.
Because of its direct link to atonement.
Precisely. The connection to life and atonement from Leviticus puts it in a whole different category, a unique theological one that you could argue transcends that simple dietary bucket. It's about honoring the very vehicle of atonement.
I really like that framing. It elevates the whole discussion. It's not about food, it's about reverence.
It is. Or here's another, maybe even more direct way to do it.
Okay.
You could show how that Levitical logic, that blood makes atonement by means of the life, still requires physical abstinence to fully honor that life-for-life substitution, even after Christ.
So even though salvation is by grace, the act of abstaining from blood remains this sort of permanent sign of respect for how atonement works.
Exactly. It becomes an honorific. And that forces the opponent to deal with the theological reason for the ban itself, not just its historical context. It's a much harder argument to dismiss.
That gives the author 2 very strong concrete paths forward. So once that core argument is fortified, we need to be crystal clear about who it's aimed at.
Yes. And that brings us to the next point. The material scope could be sharpened by ensuring greater rhetorical precision when defining Christendom and categorizing the groups mentioned as exceptions.
I saw this right at the beginning. You have this list, the Eastern Orthodox Church, Jehovah's Witnesses, Iglesia Ni Cristo, Islam, and Judaism, all kind of thrown in together.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a bit of a theological jumble. You've got non-Christian faiths next to non-Trinitarian denominations, next to ancient Christian traditions.
And that's the weakness. It momentarily dilutes the focus. The reader is left wondering, wait, is this a critique of Christianity specifically, or monotheism in general?
Right, when the real target is the interpretation within historical, mainstream Christianity.
That's it. So the suggestion is to narrow that focus. Be really precise about the theological streams being targeted. If the goal is to critique the majority Western Protestant and Catholic traditions, which it seems to be, then you need to separate those other groups out.
You do.
So, for example, one way to do it would be to restructure that opening. You could focus only on the differences within major Christian traditions first.
Like Eastern Orthodox versus Western denominations.
Exactly. Frame it as an internal Christian debate right from the start. Then, later in the piece, You can bring in Islam and Judaism as these external comparators that show the historical breadth of the prohibition.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. The theological fight is internal, and the other faiths just provide context.
It cleans up the argument. Or, another approach, just be explicit. Qualify the target right in the opening sentence.
How so?
Something like, most of Western Christendom, particularly post-Reformation Protestant traditions. You immediately signal who you're talking about, especially in the context of dishes like, dinduguan or Swedish blood pancakes.
That precision adds a layer of authority. It makes the critique much harder to sidestep.
It does, which leads us actually to that opening.
Yeah, let's talk about the structure, because the information is all there, but the way it's presented could have so much more punch.
I agree. The opening of the document, while it's vivid, could be restructured to establish the central theological conflict, which is Acts 10 versus Acts 15, before diving into all the examples.
Right. So the weakness at the moment is that it starts with the list of groups that abstain, then a list of blood foods, and only then does it get to the core tension.
And that tension it's the whole ballgame. It's Peter's vision in Acts 10 to slay and eat versus the Jerusalem Council's very clear prohibitions in Acts 15.
By delaying that, you're kind of bearing the lead.
You're bearing the intellectual hook. The expert reader you're writing for is already familiar with this stuff. They're looking for that conflict, that paradox. That's what's interesting to them.
So the suggestion is to front-load it. Start with the interpretive problem.
Start with the problem. Make the cultural examples, the blood tofu, the diniguan, make them the consequences of the theological misstep, not the introduction to it.
Okay, that feels much stronger. What would that actually look like? Can you give a concrete example of a rephrased opening?
Sure. You could start the whole piece with something provocative, like, the modern Christian interpretation of dietary law presents a stark historical paradox.
I like that.
How did the sweeping freedom granted to Peter in Acts 10 supersede the explicit apostolic injunctions codified just a few chapters later in Acts 15?
Wow. Yeah, that immediately sets the terms of the debate. It puts the burden of proof on the other side, on the people who rely so heavily on the Acts 10 vision.
It does. And then right after that, you could synthesize the Acts 15 prohibition, quote St. James, show this was the final word from the early church.
And then bring in the food examples?
Then you bring them in. You use the blood pletzar and the sionji as the living, breathing evidence that this historical conflict is still playing out on dinner plates today. It grounds the theology in something visceral.
This has been incredibly helpful. So, to recap, we've really hit on 3 major areas to strengthen what is already a very solid piece of work.
That's right. First, we talked about deepening the engagement with that new covenant counterargument. You can't just note it, you have to dismantle it.
Then, second, refining the scope, being really precise with terms like Christendom to make sure the critique is aimed at the right target.
And finally, sharpening that opening. Get that core conflict, the Acts 10 versus Acts 15 paradox, right up front to maximize that intellectual impact from the very first sentence.
So the actionable takeaways for the author are pretty clear. Engage the opposition's best argument, define your target with surgical precision, and lead with your most compelling intellectual puzzle.
Exactly. I mean, it's an excellent piece of research, and I think these changes will just make the argument that much more compelling and, frankly, much more difficult to ignore.
We really look forward to seeing the results. When you've had a chance to implement these revisions, please do send it back our way for a future critique.